to Ellevate Louisiana Engage podcast. Ellevate Louisiana was founded earlier this year to empower women leaders throughout Louisiana by connecting and educating them on the challenges impacting our state with data-driven, nonpartisan solutions to make a better future for Louisiana. Hello, I'm your host, Julie Stokes. Today, we're recording the second episode in a series on Louisiana's budget and taxation policy. Our guest joining us today is Jason DeCuir, who is the co-owner and partner with Advantous Consulting, a leading tax services firm in Louisiana. Well, prior to his work in the private sector, he also served as chief of staff, assistant secretary, and executive counsel at the Louisiana Department of Revenue. And during his tenure, I think your tenure was about 2011 through 2014, and that's when I met him. In these roles, he was an advisor to 3 different secretaries of LDR and also to the governor on legal and policy issues affecting state taxation. Mr. DeCuir has been appointed to serve on a good number of councils and commissions, including my own, which was the Louisiana Sales Tax Streamlining and Modernization Commission. He's really carved a niche for himself as one of the foremost policy experts within the walls of the state capitol, advocating for tax policy ideas and reforms. Welcome, Jason.
Well, thank you, Representative Stokes, and I appreciate the kind words and introduction. And it is true that when I was at the department, I had the good fortune of meeting you and talking to you probably more than we had sometimes wanted to about tax issues affecting the state of Louisiana. And I just wanted to thank you for all of what you have done in terms of trying to move our system and structure along to make it more competitive. And I see that you're still at it, so that makes me excited.
Yeah, well, I do love it. I do love it, and I care an awful lot about it, as I know you do as well. And there's 144 legislators in that capital that we need to make sure understand, and a lot of them already understand, obviously, and are ready to potentially change the trajectory of Louisiana in this session coming up. And you know, I'd say before we start, the reason why this particular session is so important is that there are only 2 fiscal sessions in each 4-year term. The first fiscal session is in the 2nd year of the term, and the final fiscal session is in then the 4th year of the term. Tax issues can only be legislated during those fiscal sessions, and it's not exactly prime time to legislate with regard to tax in the midst of your final session before your reelection. So this is really the prime time for anything real and substantive to occur. So that's why we're spending so much energy on this, you know, in this set of videocasts and also in the symposium that will be coming up on January 28th and 29th. But we'll get to that when we're finished recording. So Jason has prepared a great presentation, and we're just going to have a little bit of conversation back and forth as he goes through it. If you're listening by podcast, you can always peek at the videocast after you finish your podcast and look at the slides that were on the screen that you might not have been able to see. But we'll try to keep most of it in the context where you'll understand it by podcast without necessarily seeing it. So I'm going to turn it over to Jason.
Well, thanks again, Representative. And just to kind of piggyback off the point that you made before I get into the slides, you're right. It occurs in the 2nd year and in the 4th year of the fiscal session. I think the unique thing this time, which makes it a little bit different, that we've kind of seen is kind of new in our history in the over 20 years that I've been doing this, is that the last couple of sessions have been called by the legislature, not the governor. And so normally you would say, well, it's a lame duck governor going in and wanting to do tax reform, so the chances may not be good. Well, now it may not be a lame duck governor necessarily call. Obviously the dates are prescribed, but the legislature is really kind of leading what's on the agenda. Our legislature is majority Republican, but they're kind of taking the helm and putting these ideas together in their own plans and not so much relying on the governor to push these things forward. So that is a little unique since I've been doing it. We'll see if that helps things in terms of moving things forward. or if we kind of stay stuck in the rut that we've been stuck in. But as you mentioned, which I think is a good segue, and really, I just provided these slides just to give our viewers and our listeners an idea of what's kind of transpired over the course of the past several years. Obviously, in the last term of Governor Bobby Jindal is really when we started to understand that the state was in a, quote, budget deficit situation. Why? Well, because oil prices begin to drop. As you know, Louisiana historically had been very dependent upon severance taxes. And if oil prices drop and they're not drilling in Louisiana, then we can't collect those revenues. And so although that was only about $103 million, and I say only, I mean, that's still significant, it really began to drive the tax reform discussion in a way that should Louisiana continue to be so dependent on severance tax that our budget goes as the price of oil and gas and drilling goes. And we know we're still in a situation right now in Louisiana where they're not drilling. And so here's where the discussion begins about diversifying our economy, right? Should we start looking at new and other sectors to attract to Louisiana? That doesn't mean in any way get rid of the oil. I think that needs to be still a component of our economic picture, but we also need to look at attracting new and different industries to Louisiana so we're not so dependent. That way, when we hit these issues with oil prices, the budget is not necessarily in a state of flux. But obviously, as you know, after that happened, we elected then Governor John Bel Edwards. He came in and he painted a much more bleak budget picture, and realizing the deficit and from their purview was really close to about $2 billion. And that's really when things really became, intense, as you would know, sitting in the legislature, and how are we going to, and how are we going to resolve this? And as you can see here in 2016, that's when we enacted the extra penny, or the 5th cent. We moved our sales tax from 4 cents to 5 cents. Yes.
Jason, I want to kick back over to what we were talking about with 2015, because I know for me, when I got in the legislature, it was 2013, and we were, you and Tim Barfield were at the head table of my first meeting rolling out the Jindal tax reform. And of course, that didn't work, but there were some good points to it. And I think that was, for a lot of us, when the idea of really reforming our tax code really kind of took hold. Even though it didn't work that particular year, you saw it over and over and over again in different shades and different varieties ever since. And, I'm looking back at that 2015 number, and the way I remember it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember like going into that 2015 session with like a $1 billion deficit. And we raised, I think, and most of it didn't work. I remember like 700 something million dollars worth of revenue, most of which was shaving economic development credits and the like. And, our folks over at GNO Inc., where you're sitting right now, I think could remind us all about that. They were not the biggest fans of that.
No.
But a lot of that revenue generating didn't work because, if you trim economic development, then corporations just act differently and, change their behaviors so that they don't, lose that much money on things. And then the way I recall it in 2015, didn't like oil had fallen to like $60 a barrel or something like that from over 100. And then by the end of 2015, going into the 2016 session, it fell to $28 a barrel. Isn't that like, that's kind of how I recollect it.
I think that's spot on. So and I didn't start way back into 2013 when I was involved with tax reform and putting the governor's tax package on the table. Now, keep in mind, as I mentioned in my opening, that was the governor pushing his plan forward as a lame duck. What I think is going on right now is you do have a lame duck governor, but you have the legislature pushing a plan forward. So that's the difference I was talking about. Yeah. But I think the biggest problem, as you see in the middle of that slide, I mean, in the middle of that paragraph under 2015 is, if you recall, Julie, all of these things were temporary in nature. They were only 3 years. And so because it only lasted for 3 years, it solved the today problem, but then you all in 16 had to figure out how we're going to solve the tomorrow problem and going forward, because all that temporary revenue was going to fall off. And there was no rationale to the madness of how they generated revenue. As you know, we went across the board and just chopped things by 28%. It didn't care what it was or who was impacting. We just chopped all credits and incentives by 28%. We then shaved the inventory tax credit by 25%. I mean, we just chopped, we took net operating losses and said you only get 72%. And so we did a bunch of these strange things to our tax code that, one, were not necessarily the greatest policy. And I get the perspective of legislators, you needed money instantaneously. But two, it also hurt our tax structure and rankings and system across the country by doing that. And then thirdly, we still didn't resolve anything. We still had to figure out what was going to be the sustainability of our tax system. And ironically, that is the conversation we are still having today, because although we did some temporary things like the clean penny and the dirty penny, and then the governor in 2017 tried to push his own tax reform plan based off of the HCR 11 report, but we realized it was only certain things in the HCR 11 report. And we know the HCR 11 report never recommended a commercial activity tax, but that found its way in there. All the way to our latest 2018, where Representative Paula Davis and her group came in, and we basically took the sales tax rate and moved it down from 5 to 4.45, where most people don't realize we are still sitting on that temporary tax structure. So the problem is we've never made anything permanent. This 4.45 again is temporary and rolls off in 2025. So you can still say that we don't have a permanent, sustainable tax system or structure in Louisiana dating back to those changes you mentioned in 2015. And now we're a half a decade in and we still haven't resolved the problem. And so that's where I think the real issue is and what's bringing all of the discussion about.
Jason, were you on the HCR 11 task force?
I was, I guess, fortunately and unfortunately, but yes, I was on there, and
I thought so.
you know, there was a whole bunch of recommendations that came out, some of which I thought were really good in nature, some of which, you know, again, my opinion, I was one of about 13, but so that you know, you had economists from Loyola and Tulane, you had the governor, the administration, division of administration, the revenue secretary, you had a few people from business. So it was you had local government groups. So it was a pretty broad, robust group that produced a very comprehensive report.
Right. And it was in a lot of ways, it was in sync with what I've seen the Tax Foundation come out in terms of reform for Louisiana and other groups. So, you know, I hope that we hearken back to some of those arguments and some of those ideas. And I see that, you know, like the difference for me is, if we're going to reform, say, income tax, do you want to reform it in a progressive way or in a flat way?
That's right.
You know, it's different arguments like that. Anyway, okay.
And as we move through that conversation, I think you're going to see at the end, if we have time, where I think legislators are going, really are very much in sync with some of those ideas that were pushed out in HCR 11. I think we just have to make sure, as we hear, and I know the word makes us sick sometimes, is we're doing it in a holistic way that includes tax types across the board, you know. So But you know, to the conversation we're having, well, why does all of what I just said create an impact on Louisiana? Well, because people pull these maps up all the time that you're intimately familiar with, Julie, and this paints the business tax climate picture in Louisiana. And you can see down there, we have and this is the Tax Foundation. We're in the 10 worst business states in terms of tax climate, sitting at 42. And what folks love to point out is how is Texas doing and how is Florida doing? And, you know, we sit right in the middle of those two. We're constantly competing. And so what the argument is how do we make this number 42, how do we push that number into a much better ranking? And the only way that we can do that is by fixing our tax structure as a whole. Because if you look on the left side of the chart, the way we get to the 42 is it averages out all of the various tax types we have to get to one overall composite ranking. So why, as I just mentioned, do we have to go into all the tax buckets? Well, because all of our tax buckets are performing fairly poor. And we may not be able to put them all into the top 10, but if we can make a significant improvements in each of them, it's going to get us to a much more competitive ranking. And no, this map doesn't get into the details of how each tax type works, but I will tell you, companies, businesses, industry pull these things up and say, let me look and see which part of the country is best for me to go in. And they start at these types of rankings that say, well, how is the tax climate? They also look at the education climate. They look at the overall living condition climate, et cetera, transportation, infrastructure. This is one of many high-level factors that they look at. And so if you look to the left, corporate taxes, we fare near the bottom. Individual income taxes, as you just mentioned, Julie, we fare near the bottom. Sales tax, I know we're probably both here giggling. How did we move from 50 to 49? One state now has a higher top end combined rate than we do. So we did go from 50 to 49. Property tax, I'm going to, I guess, gloat a little bit. The reason we were able to move up 10 spots in property tax is because during the special sessions that we just had coming right as COVID-19 became very prominent in the country, we stood up the Louisiana Economic Recovery Task Force, and many small businesses were having to pay franchise tax and didn't have the revenue to pay it. So we began to phase out franchise tax, which is a tax on your capital, i.e. your property of your business, which is why it's in the property tax index. And as we were able to phase that out and get it passed, you can see what a minimal change does to our overall ranking. It moved us up 10 spots to 23. And so if we can continue to make good, positive changes like that, you would then see that it's possible that our overall ranking structure, appearance to the rest of the country will begin to improve. I'm not going to necessarily belabor the point here, but it's worth noting in the sales tax ranking, everybody has us ranked pretty low. This is just how we rank with respect to sales tax, 49th, but the map to the right, as you can see, Arkansas is just the 10th better than us at 9.53. We're at 9.52. And perhaps that's you know, one of the reasons that we're not 50th, but we're 49th. But the map over here to the right is just based on our sales tax rate, not the overall ranking that I mentioned to you earlier. And then one of the issues that I know that you've worked so hard on before, you've passed legislation and worked on bills dealing with inventory tax. And again, like the franchise tax, which is a tax on your business's assets, not taking into anything consideration of how you're doing from an income or profit standpoint. Inventory typically is perceived as a bad tax. It's a tax on the inventory that your business stores or keeps that is for sale. And so, as you can see, we're one of few states that have an inventory tax. It's a property tax on your inventory. It's not an income or sales tax, but in essence, the amount of inventory that is found in your warehouse or found on the grounds of your business on a certain date is going to be subject to property tax. And most states are phasing that out. Although it says that Texas taxes business inventory, they have a couple of county exemptions that actually exempts it. in terms of goods in transit and other, the Freeport exemption that basically says if the goods are in transit or they're not stored over a certain period of time in Texas, then we're not going to tax it as inventory. And so there are little nuances that Louisiana could look at like that in order to phase or potentially push this tax away.
Yeah, I wanted to touch just really quickly on property tax and inventory tax and sales tax and how they all kind of fit together. In Louisiana, we've got, is it the largest homestead exemption in the country, or?
One of the largest, yes.
Yeah, it's, if not maybe second or something like that, largest.
Yes.
So what that does is that creates a deficit in the amount of funding that our local governments receive. So in a lot of other states, that property tax base for your home provides a lot of the funding for your schools and your local roads and your infrastructure on a local level. Well, in Louisiana, because we're missing that part of that base of property tax, our local governments have higher sales tax rates. That's actually what pushes our combined tax rate for sales tax to look so high compared to other states. And then when you look also at inventory tax, those local governments are collecting the tax on that inventory. So Louisiana doesn't collect the tax on that inventory. And that's why it's so hard to legislate with regard to it, because it's not our money in a way. And then
Very,
to
no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
complicate that, not only do we not collect the money, but we're trying to legislate with regard to possibly getting rid of it. But we decided many, many years ago that instead of just saying we don't want to have an inventory tax anymore, the state stepped in and said, we'll keep letting the local governments collect it, but we'll refund it as a state to all of the corporations. And I don't know what the dollar amount of that massive refund is to everyone, but it's a good bit of money for sure. Do you know how much that's worth now, Jason?
Yeah, so right now it's still hovering about the 250 to 275 mark. At one time, it used to be, closer to 350 to 400. But remember, the reason that it has begun to move in a downward trajectory is obviously there was a 25% haircut to it at one point that businesses got back. There was a bill that went through that you may remember, sponsored by Senator J.P. Morrell at the time, that says if your inventory refund is over a certain amount, you do not get it all at once. It gets carried forward. So now companies are carrying that on the books. And then thirdly, Senator Rick Ward came in and passed a bill that said if you get ITEP, then you no longer get your inventory refunded to you as a refund after you pay it. So all three of those things would argue that has lowered the amount of the credit. And then I will tell you what that has done, and rightly so. It is forced businesses to really look at how their inventory is being valued at the local level, to make sure that they are only paying the actual and right amount and not getting credited back for amounts that would be more than they should have paid. And I think those are important points. The second thing I'll say in relationship to your comment, this really breeds of a much larger discussion. And that is, how much control do we give to local governments? But in turn, how much do we still continue to fund to local governments through our budgetary process? I agree with you, because there's such a large homestead exemption, then we have to make that up in local sales tax. But I would also argue that at times our income tax rate also has to stay higher, because we have a revenue sharing fund that we as a state, we have to fund in order to give the money back to local governments that they're exempting from homestead. And that money is distributed back from the state because it's being stamped out at the local level. And the only way that we can continue to fund that is if we generate enough money at the state level, so it keeps our other taxes higher in order to pay those funds back to. So what we really need to figure out is the balance between control at the local level and how much in our budget should we be subsidizing local government.
Right. And that revenue sharing, just so that people at home understand what we're talking about, revenue sharing, that's money going directly from the state to the locals, was something that we started all those years ago when we enacted the homestead exemption. So we said, as a state legislature, we enacted a homestead exemption, which basically meant a big revenue decrease to the local governments. And we said, to make up for that, we're going to give you this revenue stream every year. So if that should sound something sort of like what we just talked about with the inventory tax. And there's a few little items like this, but the inventory tax is another big one, where we didn't want to say that they couldn't collect the inventory tax anymore, but instead we refund it back to the local governments. And in essence, what it's done is it's another sort of like a revenue sharing agreement all over again. So there's a lot of little unique flows of how Louisiana works that you won't see in other states.
And yes, and that's absolutely right. And just the third point that I think is critical to bring into this discussion before we get off of property tax is the reforms that have been made to the industrial tax exemption program. And the reason I say that is because we are now talking about local sources of revenue, inventory tax, homestead exemption. The ITEP program used to be a 100% abatement for companies if they qualify under the program. We know the governor stepped in and immediately cut that program by 20%, meaning now local governments are automatically getting 20% of the revenue related to ITEP contracts that they otherwise would not have received. And I don't, and I know some of my clients may cringe when I say that, I don't have necessarily an issue with that. And I think local government should have control over that revenue because it's property tax revenue. However, the issue that I have is we're not looking at the other side of the equation and the amount that we're still funding to local governments because they ordinarily did not have access to this revenue. And as we're pushing it down, we need to be having a conversation about the other side of the equation so that we can begin to potentially lower and reform taxes for everybody. And so that's the part of the discussion that I'm concerned about, is not being in the mix simultaneously with the other reforms.
Well, and that is a good point. You know, I also think about how the ITEP, or the Industrial Tax Exemption Program, was actually one of the big economic development tools that we use to bring big industry to Louisiana. And I remember discussions about that toward the end of the prior or the Jindal administration, and talking about how we had the most generous ITEP program in the country. And where do we fall now? Are we still very generous, or where do we fall now in that continuum?
Yeah, and you know, I guess I'm not sure where exactly we would rank. I would say that many states do this differently again than Louisiana does it, which is probably no shock. The problem with our ITEP system now is the complexity, like all of our other taxes, that you have to go through in order to qualify or get the exemption. In Texas, it's purely a local decision. It's their revenue, they decide, and once they decide, that's it. In Louisiana, I get pushing it back down to local governments, but then you still have to go make your case to the Board of Commerce and Industry. You still have to go make your case to LED. And then, oh, by the way, the governor still got the power of the pen. And after you've made your case to locals, BCNI and LED, he could still say yes or no. And so the problem with all of these things is just too complex. And so that's where I think whether we go 80-20, whether we go 50-40, whatever we do, we just got to make it more simple. And now with ITEP and all the different rules at each one of the parishes, it has really just become a real mess, and it's preventing companies from taking advantage of it. The other thing I would argue is, I agree with you, we could say that ITEP may be one of the more generous programs in the country, but a lot of these credit and incentive programs we have are to cover up a bad tax climate and structure that we have.
Absolutely.
And if we could get that portion of it figured out, I think then more companies would be inclined to do business here without having to give out the most generous ITEP or that incentive to make up for. So
Right. Well, you could say the same of getting better roads and
That's
enhancing the
exactly right.
education of our citizens and the health. Yeah, it's very complicated. There's no one thing fits
It's
all.
all.
Anyway,
It-
I
That's
want you to keep going. I'm sorry.
No,
We
no,
linger.
I know you and we can get on. That's what I love about your passion for this and wanting to figure out solutions. And so, again, I'm not going to harp on this. This just outlines our corporate income tax, as you can see in our region and as it relates to the rest of the country. Again, one of the highest top end marginal rates in the country. You don't see a rate there for Texas. Why? Because they don't have a corporate income tax. So it's very easy to compute. Now, what I want to be clear, and which I hadn't said yet, is that just because you see these top end marginal rates does not necessarily mean that Louisiana corporations pay more in corporate income tax than our peers around the country. The problem is the sticker shock of our system. And after you figure out the myriad of federal income tax deductions and all the other deductions that may fit into our system, you may come out paying about the same or being competitive. It's just that, again, you're putting companies, corporations, businesses through the exercise of having to go through and capture each and every exemption, deduction to get to a low rate that other states just start out at. You know, they just start
Yeah.
out with less exemptions and a lower rate. And so this really highlights that. And I really think you're going to see some legislation come. I know you were at the front end of proposing legislation that was going to reduce this top end rate and repeal our federal income tax deduction so that we weren't married to the federal system. And I know that got out and that was put on the ballot, and unfortunately it did not pass, but I sense that there's a galvanization to maybe pick that up again and move it forward.
Well, and you know, that is the single biggest driver between that 8% rate in Louisiana, whereas you know you have, you know, if you read Arkansas over to South Carolina all in a row, 6.55, 6.5, 5.755, you know, all of those state rates, and then you've got our 8%. If and by the calculations that we had, if you got rid of the federal income tax deduction, which nobody aside from Iowa, who you can see also has an enormously high corporate income tax rate. And I think it was it Alabama.
Yes.
Those two states still allow the corporate income tax, federal income tax deduction in full. And it just really doesn't make sense. And honestly, right now, I bet that people wish we would have passed that legislation that went to the ballot, because when corporate taxes went down so much with the Trump administration, that would have made state
That's a
income
great,
taxes go way up.
that's a great point, and I didn't highlight that on the early slides when we were talking about how were we able to drop our sales tax rate from 5 to 4.45. Well, really, Louisianians probably don't realize because when President Trump cut taxes at the federal level, our taxes went up in Louisiana, and that extra 330 million that was kind of hidden and baked in there, just the way that our structure worked, was used to buy the rate down from 5 to 4.45. And so while the rest of the country was experiencing tax cuts all the way down through the state, their state system, our taxes actually went up for most Louisianians just
Right.
by the way you calculate our income tax in Louisiana. So that's a
Yeah.
great point.
Yeah.
So
And wait, I want to say one more thing, and
yes,
we don't need to expound on it, but Texas looks like it has no corporate income tax because it doesn't have an exactly a income tax. They do have what's called the Texas margin
that's correct.
tax, that is a tax on more or less gross receipts or gross margin, which is too complicated to explain, but they do have a corporate income tax, so to speak. They
Yes,
do
they
have a
do
corporate level
tax
tax.
they do tax the receipts of business. They look at your receipts, your income, and not really your income. It's really your gross revenue is what they look at with some minor deductions. And then they have a very low rate that they use. And obviously that tax is historically frowned upon by the Tax Foundation and others. We were
Very
looking at
much.
a hybrid of the CAT, commercial activity tax, but nevertheless, the reason they're still able to be ranked so high is they have one bad tax, but they don't have an individual income tax they can run around saying they don't have a corporate income tax. Their sales tax, which we'll get into, is controlled through a centralized system. And so you have a lot of other simplicities that are baked into their system that cause them to have a top 10 ranking in the country.
Right.
So I guess at this point, the viewers probably realize what are the problems, because we've gone through a lot of them. But I'll just highlight them as it relates to the tax buckets real quickly, and then I'll kind of turn it over to you if you have any other follow-up. But here's where the HCR recommended. This is, to me, the most, all of the other recommendations are meaningful, but I think if Louisiana wants to get its house in order, this is where we have to have meaningful discussion. And this came straight from the HCR 11 final conclusions and recommendations. And it says the first step in dealing with the state and local division is to create a fiscal structure for local governments that will allow local governments an opportunity to financially handle their own responsibilities. If they're able to do that, the state should also consider reducing some of its commitment to local governments, as locals are given more authority to raise revenues and those revenues are collected. What is that saying? As we push more control down to local governments and put them in control of their revenue base, we won't have to raise so much revenue at the state level. We can stop having to raise as much and not have to have as high taxes as we do and make some of these reforms, because we won't have to worry about distributing as much back to local governments, because we're giving them the ability to raise revenue on their own. So I think that is a very important recommendation that came out of there. We talked a little bit about sales tax. I'm not going to hit all of these bullets. Whoops, I did not mean to go that fast. But basically, Louisiana is only one of about 2 states really now that don't have a centralized sales tax system. I think we are sitting on legal shaky ground with respect to collecting remote tax. And this is sales. When I say remote, these are the online sellers that I know you are very familiar with, that don't necessarily have a brick and mortar in Louisiana. But the Supreme Court has basically said, if you have an economic nexus, you can begin to collect from these out-of-state online sellers. However, what the Supreme Court said is you have to have a simplified sales tax collection system. Obviously, if you ask me, we don't meet that. And we are already collecting taxes from these out-of-state online retailers that don't have bricks and mortar. And if a taxpayer were to contest or file suit, I think Louisiana could be in another budget situation where, if it is found our sales tax system doesn't meet what the Supreme Court said, we could be stuck handing this money back. And this is money that we've collected and spent. So if anything at all, we need to centralize or get to a simplified system for sales tax, just so that we can legitimately collect the money that's due, not just to the state of Louisiana, but to local governments as well. And so those are things that we need to contemplate in terms of fixing our sales tax system. We hit income and franchise tax. You and I just talked about, we piggyback the federal system and the problems that has caused, most recently with President Trump's tax cut not filtering down to Louisianians. Also, we're one of only a few states that allow for this federal income tax deduction. That parentheses, by the way, is not California. That means that it would take a constitutional amendment in order to repeal that. That's what makes this so tough year in and year out, is we can do yeoman's work in the legislature, but the people are going to have to vote on helping reform in our system. I think this is a good time to point out as well that many of the reforms that you and I are talking about, whether it relates to homestead exemption, inventory tax, ITEP, centralizing sales tax, they all require constitutional amendments. And so the people of Louisiana are going to have to step up and also play a role in getting this to us. You can't just blame it on the legislature, because when they roll these things out of the Capitol, we then have to enact them from a state perspective.
Right.
I talked about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. I'm not going to hit on that again. And then I just wanted to mention, as we did talk about already, that we have a very complicated franchise tax that needs to be brought into the discussion and figure out. I've already showed you how our rankings improved by making minimal phase out to that lowest tier of taxable capital for small businesses. And then we've talked about property tax. As a property tax on inventory, it creates budget challenges for the state by having to refund the credit that you mentioned back. And then how some of the ITEP changes and marrying ITEP with the inventory tax has created some confusion here for businesses in the realm of things. So that kind of concludes some of the slides and talking about the problems. What I can say in some of my final remarks is that, and I hinted at this at the beginning, that the legislature and its leadership, both the president and the speaker, are on board with looking at tax reform ideas. They have tasked both Representative or Chairman Stuart Bishop at Ways and Means to form a little work group, and Senator Brett Alon has done the same thing on the Senate side. And they are working on crafting ideas, I can tell you, that fit into a couple of buckets. One, centralizing our sales tax system. Senator Brett Alon, as you know, created a commission to look at phasing out the inventory tax, trying to figure out how not to do any real damage to the local coffers as he goes and figures that out. They do want to look at eliminating the federal income tax deduction and lowering both corporate and individual rates. There's a lot of detail within there. Do we go to one rate, two rates, a flat rate? Those are all the details that we have to look at. I mentioned phasing out the franchise tax. And then the last one that we really didn't hit on much except at the early slide, I do believe that we have to make our severance tax system more competitive and get it out of the dark ages and up to more of what is reality and how these companies transact business in today's age. We are still sitting on some antiquated things, in the fact that we tax oil differently than we tax gas. And I mean, I don't know if there's any real reason to do that. Most states tax them the same way, and so we have two completely different structures for that. And as oil prices begin to rise, if we don't fix this in the interim, they're going to go and start drilling in other states until Louisiana gets that situation figured out. And so we do need to look at reforming that. But with that, Julie, I'd be glad to answer any other questions or continue the dialogue with you. So.
Yeah, I mean, as I went and I actually met last week with that small working group in the House, and we talked about the area of sales tax reform. In sales tax reform, there's a few different issues. There's one which relates to sales tax collection, how those taxes are collected. Right now, as you said earlier, but just to expound upon it a little bit, in Louisiana, the state collects the state portion, which is the 4.45, and then every local government, that means every parish generally, collects its own sales tax at whatever rate they collect it. In most other states, there's one collector, and it probably, honestly, it's the state. In most other states, the state collects it, remits it to the parishes, or that'll be counties. The problem with the way that it's structured in Louisiana is a lot buried in that Wayfair decision, which the Wayfair decision is what allowed governments to start collecting tax on internet sales, basically. The Wayfair decision said that you had to basically have a very simple system of collection. Probably, for them, it was centralized collection, but at least so that the collection method didn't create an undue burden on business. Right. And you're correct in the fact that, we could be called out at some point for the way we still have things structured. Although we did form, and I actually authored the bill to form a remote sellers collection board. Yeah. And so that remote sellers board does collect those sales taxes for all of the internet sales tax. Right. In that same bill, we also formed a local uniform sales tax board, which was there, and it hasn't been able to really get off the ground all the way yet. and that's a long backstory, but there to try to get the locals together so that they would start to more or less interpret the definitions and the rules in the same uniform manner across the state. The way it is right now, if parish A believes that a business owes them sales tax, parish B might also believe that that same business owes them sales tax. And because they all have their individual administrations, that's it, that business could, have to pay sales tax in both jurisdictions until that matter's resolved. So that's one of the key elements of trying to get a uniform collector. And the other thing is audits. To some degree, you could be audited by a myriad of parishes in any one year. Does that happen all the time? Not necessarily. And there are some mitigating, things out there. But generally speaking, that's what creates such an undue burden on business. You also have multiple forms and multiple ideologies, but generally we've created systems where you can go in and do a one filing system. But, when you start to work in that space of even doing that, how are the parishes going to coordinate on audit? What interpretations are we going to agree upon, whether this tax is payable to Jefferson or St. Charles Parish or whatever other parishes out there? So that's issue number one. The other issue in sales tax is what's called a uniform base. So the way it stands right now, we have the set of items that's taxable all around the state. And, some parishes exempt things and the other parish right next door doesn't exempt those things. So the base of items that are taxable all around the state differs. That is the real, very, very super difficult thing to fix. And it's something really important for us to fix. And, Jason, that's one of the things that I discussed with those legislators last week, that, unless the legislature can get the help of the Department of Revenue in trying to fix that and the help of all those local governments, that's a really tough thing to do. What do you think the prospects are out there for actually being able to get those two things, the centralized collection and the uniform base throughout the state? What do you think the prospects are for the 2021 session?
Yeah, great question. I know we didn't have time to dive into a ton of that, but just recently, the Speaker of the House, Clay Shake Snyder, created a task force / study group. It was called HR 31, or that was the enabling legislation, and it brought local collectors, Department of Revenue, some legislators, businesses, and the good government groups, bar, cable, and economists together. And obviously going into that, the thought was that same old, nothing will get done. I was asked to chair that by the speaker, and I will tell you, I guess if there is some good news, a day that I never thought I would see in my lifetime, even though it's not legislation and it hasn't happened, is we were able to get local governments, business, and the legislatures to agree. Local governments actually came with a plan endorsed by the sheriff, endorsed by LMA, endorsed by the school board, and endorsed by the police jury that agreed we need to centralize our system. I never thought I would hear those words from local collectors. So I guess the good news is they do agree we need a constitutional amendment, and they're supportive of that, okay? Obviously, the devil is in the details. They asked for a couple of things as it relates to the constitutional amendment. One, yes, the legislature would have the ability to create the system. And I think where a lot of what you're talking is what would the system look like, and we'd have to get to that. Two, that they agreed that this would have to be a new entity, a new state entity. So that's a little different. What that would mean is this wouldn't just get pushed to the Department of Revenue, but local governments feel like they have to be a part of it. It has to be a new entity, and they have to have just as much say as the state has. And so basically this would mean that the Department of Revenue would be getting out of the sales tax business, and this entity would be responsible for all of sales tax collection for the state of Louisiana. It's such a powerful obligation and
Yep.
responsibility. And they looked at dividing it into three different divisions, if you will: a state division, a local division, and a remote sales division. That's how they want. What they are arguing about in real time is the control of the board, obviously. Okay. And so the local governments want the control and the makeup of the board one way, the Department of Revenue wants control and the makeup of the board another way. Those are the details that they have to sort out. But the good news is they're both still agreeing that this is what we need to do. And when you start getting into the audit functions and the base functions, and I know you have done tremendous work on your commission and trying to harmonize the base. I think if there's a silver lining here is that if we get the state and local governments into one entity working together, I think it's by default, it's going to kind of force us to get to that uniform base, because I really think they're going to get tired of trying to figure out the base here and the base there and realize that's just not efficient for sales tax collection. And so I think once we get them all in one pot, so to speak, I think we can pick that stuff that you've been working on up and start saying, okay, now that we're all together, we're all one, let's try to make our base all one too. And then I think a lot of the audit function absolutely needs to be a component of this. I think there is still a little concern about how much audit authority local governments cede to this entity, but they realize it's a necessary. And I think that's going to have to morph over time by statute. But as long as we can create the entity, change the Constitution, then we have the ability to develop the system over time. And when you're talking about this much money and this much of a structural change, there needs to be a transition plan anyway. It's going to take some time to make sure that we do it right.
Yeah, and honestly, when you look at it, the real rub is in a lot of ways for the locals, because if the locals, if a board is put into place to be the collector, the locals' decision on whether or not the thing is taxable and collecting the tax, it's not really the state's end of it that's going to be the big question mark. And correct me if I'm wrong, because if it's taxable, the state's going to get their share. It's which parish it's taxable in and making sure that it comes into the proper parish that's going to be the real rub there. And in a lot of ways, it's the locals that are going to be giving up so much of their authority. For what it's worth, one of the suggestions that I thought is that you take that you have an even number of people from local and state, and then you hire somebody to be the third party. Or if you have 3 people from local and 3 people from the state, you hire somebody to come in and be the executive director of it, who is, the word's not nonpartisan, but doesn't show favoritism between local and state, and, has the ability to come in and make those kind of decisions. So, I'll tell you, if we can come out of this session with that one thing done, I think you're right. I think from there, the base, it does. It moves the needle a lot.
It moves the needle tremendously. And I've always said, and that's the single greatest reform we could make in the state of Louisiana. And it's not like a how much revenue are we losing or gaining issue. It's just resolving the administrative. Of course, I like your idea on the even split and the hiring of somebody to run it. In fact, I think I know a former representative who would do a great, fantastic job at that. But let's have that discussion. I think that would be good.
Oh, I was thinking of some other former state representative who would be really good at that. But I really think they should do that. And because the locals are giving up so much in that. I always think that we really do need to get rid of that federal tax deduction.
Yes.
That's really important to making our rates look reasonable. So we'll see. I think if you could do something with centralized collection and maybe with that federal income tax deduction, you do a lot to set the state on a much better trajectory. One of the things that I recognized, in the legislature and in my time there, is that nothing happens very fast. Like, I remember thinking that in the I guess that would have been the 2015 session and then again in the 2017 session that we had a chance to change the trajectory of the state forever. And in my naive way, I thought, well, we could do all of this at one time and just create a new Louisiana. And it just doesn't work like that up there,
It
you
it
know. And
it 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 does not, and you got to have patience, you know.
yes, lots and lots.
And you know, the biggest thing, and you know this, is you and I, if we were in a vacuum and that was all that was you know, that mattered, we could probably get there. It's just that when you have 144 legislators and this is very complex information, and trying to get a good uniform, no pun intended, message out to each of them such that it's fact based and there's not a bunch of myths or this or that. And I know all of that comes into the fold, and they're drinking from a fire hose and they're trying to learn this stuff, but they're getting lobbied from 10 different ways and they're not sure. And it's hard to communicate a message about what is good for the state of Louisiana when during the during the haste of the session. Let me say that.
Yeah.
So that's one of the challenges, as you know. And
Right.
I know you've gone to that mic and that well and tried to explain and say, no, it really works this way and not that way. And it's just,
Yeah.
it's a very difficult exercise outside of trying to put the structure together. So
Yeah, it really is. And, you know, that's what Elevate Louisiana is here for. We try to bring the facts to the people and bring the facts to our members. And then we're going to have some, you know, debate over that and hopefully find some things that we can believe in enough to even sit at the table in the legislative committees and say, guys, let's really consider this. But, you know, Jason, I want to thank you for all of the work you've done for the state and wish you all the best luck with your career and, you know, wish Louisiana the best for really doing something this session to change our trajectory and lift us out of that lower than we would like ranking. That's about all the time we have for today. As a matter of fact, I think we passed up all the time we had for today at least 20 minutes ago. I want to thank our guest today, Jason DeCuir.
thank you.
And you bet. And thank all of you who had the stick with itness enough to make it through this, what I'm betting is an entire hour at this point. Jason will be joining us at our symposium, which will be over January 28th and 29th, where Ellevate will be hosting a 2-day conference with symposiums in the areas of fiscal and tax policy, as well as economic development and workforce. This 2-day event will be an opportunity for women from all around the state of Louisiana to network and learn more about the important work of Ellevate Louisiana and what's going on in our state and our chance to elevate Louisiana truly. Tickets for that event are now on sale at www.ellevatela.org. That's ELLEVATELA.org. And finally, don't forget to like Ellevate Louisiana on all your social media platforms. And please share this videocast or podcast on your page if you found it interesting. I'm your host, Julie Stokes, and we'll see you next time.